So that's where a lot of like the TanStack libraries kind of began. We needed a table library. I built one pretty much a year ago. I went full time doing TanStack, and I was good at it and I liked it, but it wasn't something where I was like, oh, this could be my career. I found myself building websites in college to make money to pay for school, where I was studying to be an audio engineer. And he's like, you'll have so much more fun. And he changed my major. He didn't even ask me. He just did it. It wasn't until React came into the picture that things really took off for me. I worked at a third-party Apple retailer called Simply Mac. So I worked at the Genius Bar and just fixed everybody's MacBooks.
Can you give us the backstory of where the idea of the TanStack or the React query came from?
People don't really know this or remember this, but I've already built a framework before. It was called Jumpsuit, and I built that with Jason Maurer. This was around the same time that Gatsby and Next.js, early Next.js, was taking off. And in those early days, I actually was competing very heavily with Next.js and Gatsby on static site generation. That's when React Query started, because I was in the thick of it with Redux. And we were managing a lot of data on the client. There were points where we were loading in just hundreds of megabytes, sometimes up to a gig of data.
Can you give the story from when the React query got popular until the TanStack was a full stack framework?
I needed to set up the open source organization so that it could be cross framework and agnostic to framework. Because at that time, everything was React something, React Query, React Table. So I decided to rebrand under TanStack. It's taken a full-time job at TanStack to really dig in and build TanStack Start.
What do you think the TanStack will do the best job for something specific? For example, building a specific type of website or application you need the TanStack for. Like I saw a meme where people or like a company are making money like using open source software, and the people that are maintaining or contributing to the open source software are not getting paid enough.
Because the reality is that most open source packages are not maintained by large numbers of people. Usually it's just one to a few people who are doing 99% of the work. Even with company sponsorships and GitHub sponsors, you know, it just never was going to bring in enough to consider it full-time. I've been designing the sustainability model for TanStack for a decade, trying to figure out how I could make it work. And for today, for right now, it's enough for me to be full-time on it, which is, I think, really impressive.
The project, and you can tell from like a big company not even maintaining their own project, nonetheless, someone not paid to be able to work on this product, to be able to work on it and maintain it. It's a lot of work behind the scene. When you are like a building open source project, it's like you are building a startup. You are betting on the success of the product. Do you think it's worth to people who are just starting out to build another framework or build like an open source project? Do you think is worth the time that you spend building that open source project, or do you think you should think twice before building an open source project?
If Vercel didn't have Next.js, I don't know if they would have grown as quickly or if they would have gotten the exposure that they got. I can't say that if somebody offered me $50 million right now that I wouldn't hand over TanStack. It's hard to say because it's never happened.
It's like a TanStack right now is your baby, so it will be hard for people to pull off your baby from you.
Very close to a release candidate. I think it will be out this summer, hopefully.
Welcome guys to Let's Code Podcast, a podcast where we interview social engineers to share their entrepreneurial story. And here we are on episode number 7 of season number 2, and we have Tanner. He is the co-founder of Nozzle and the owner of TanStack or React Query, a package that's been used with over 1 million projects. It's depending on the TanStack, with over 2 million npm downloads. Work at a French company and studied digital marketing at Utah Valley University. So let's catch up to learn more about Tanner's story after this intro. If you are a Shopify app developer, you already know when you are checking your Shopify partner dashboard account and you just see the install and the revenue. But where is the real data? For example, your monthly recurring revenue, churn rate, retention, you know, the actual number that actually tell you if your app is growing or not. And you think, I just need to set up a Google Analytics account. 3 weeks later, you are looking at custom event, goal funnel, and dashboard that break every time Shopify sneezes. And you and your team should be focusing on building feature and fixing bug instead of becoming a Google Analytics expert. And there is a better way of handling this using the sponsor of today's video, SaaS Insights, built by a Shopify developer who lived this exact nightmare. No complex setup needed or fragile tracking scripts. Just plug it in and instantly get the metric that matter, all in one clean and no BS dashboard. It's like having a growth co-founder who show up every day to just answer your question and never sleep, complain, or eat your snacks. It's affordable for Shopify so owner, fully customizable for your specific needs. Try it for free at saasinsight.com. Thank you, Tanner, for accepting my invitation. It would be a pleasure hosting you for today's episode. Can you give the audience more insight about your background so people who don't know about you will know more about you right now?
Absolutely. I've been building software since like 2008, so quite a while. But I've only been in JavaScript for probably about 12 years. And that's where I've spent most of my time over the last decade, almost. I think it was 2014, I started a company with some friends, and it was called Nozzle. And we built marketing software. It tracks Google keywords. We actually use Google servers to do this, which is funny. But we crawl Google. We store that data, and we sell that data back to SEO teams and marketers, and provide them with the tools to kind of sift through that data, because we gather quite a bit of it. So over those 10 years, I was the only front-end dev on the team, and it took a lot to figure out how to build an app by myself that would scale to serve these enterprises. So that's where a lot of the TanStack libraries kind of began. We needed a table library. I built one. We had a lot of client-side heavy data fetching. I built query. We needed better routing between all of our dashboards and drill throughs. So I started working on the router. So yeah, it was kind of ground zero for a lot of the pain points that I experienced building TanStack. And then about a year ago, pretty much a year ago, I went full-time doing TanStack. And for the last year, we've been heads down working on TanStack Start. I have which is the kind of, it wraps around TanStack Router to turn it into a full stack framework. That's been a difficult challenge. Building a full stack framework is, as people say or hopefully realize, is wrought with peril. So it's been really difficult, but it's been fun. TanStack.com has been running on either our alpha or beta version of TanStack Start for a little over a year now. We're getting close to a release candidate.
Awesome. So thank you for the introduction. And I would love to start our conversation with the first question that I already asked to my guests, which will be like a flashback of how did the first interaction with computer and how was the passion of being a web developer or a software engineer came from. So how was your experience with that?
Well, I mean, we had computers since I was a kid, and we mostly liked them for games. I played a lot of educational games. I mean, they weren't amazing, but they were good for the time. So I played a lot of educational games growing up. I remember my mom and dad buying lots of these cheap educational games for Windows 3.1. So that was my first experience with computers. I really got into it when we got the internet, and my brothers showed me how to download music with Napster, and I was just like, wow, this is crazy. So I was a pirate there for a little while as well, little pirate youth. We hadn't really thought about the implications of IP or anything like that, so we just kind of downloaded everything. And interestingly enough, that kind of led me towards software, because it was really easy in the early days of the internet to get pirated versions of high quality software that would have been otherwise too expensive to buy. I didn't know how to use very much of it, but I tried Photoshop, and I got into some illustration software, and then eventually I got into music software. I started doing a lot of music. So I played the piano and the guitar and the drums and what have you. And I was kind of an amateur audio engineer growing up. And that's really what got me interested in computers a lot. I took a web development class in high school when I was 16 years old. And I was good at it. And I liked it, but it wasn't something where I was like, oh, this could be my career. Okay. I loved music, and so I wanted to be a studio engineer, or I even wanted to get into film for a while. I went to college for like a year and a half of film school. But at the end of the day, I found myself building websites in college to make money to pay for school, where I was studying to be an audio engineer, which just felt backwards. So when I started running out of money, I was like, oh man, I need to make more. So I started building websites. And one of my professors in my department was like, what the heck are you doing? Actually, I was able to meet him again just this last month at Epic Web Conf, at Kent's Epic Web Conf here in Utah. But we were recounting this story where he said, what the heck are you doing? You know, be you shouldn't be doing audio engineering. He's like, well, you can, like, you'll love to do that as an adult, as a hobby, but that's not how you're going to make money. He's like, you need to be a software engineer. And I said, you know, I don't know about that. I don't think, you know, that doesn't sound fun. And he's like, you'll have so much more fun. And he changed my major. He didn't even ask me. He just did it. And so I studied software engineering for the rest of my, 3.5 years at school. And ever since then, I just got really into it. I had always wanted to build an app. I think anybody who grew up, who's like growing up when the iPhone came out and apps became a big thing, it's kind of like ingrained in you that you want to build an app, right? I wanted to build an iOS app like forever, but I did not want to learn Objective-C. So when I heard about this thing called Ionic, and this was 10 years ago, Ionic was cool because I was like, whoa, I can ship this application to the iOS App Store, but I can use web technology to do it, which I didn't know a whole lot of JavaScript at the time. It was mostly PHP and like the WordPress ecosystem and just MySQL. So I started learning JavaScript and Angular just so that I could ship a web app inside of Ionic to the App Store. And I did that. I built my very first app was an Ionic app using Angular 1.x. And it was a blast. I was hooked after that. So after I learned Angular, I was like, this is really fun. Front-end frameworks are very fun. I went back and I learned a couple, like I dabbled in a couple of others. I looked at Backbone and Ember and kind of learned more about those. And then I got really into just learning JavaScript, and ES6 stuff was starting to kind of come out at the time. But yeah, it wasn't until React came into the picture that things really took off for me. In fact, I remember being at the same meetup as Kent here in Utah. Actually, we always attended kind of the same meetups. So I was at the one where he gave his first talk about his Genie library. I was at the second one where he talked about JOTs, JWTs, and he actually got heckled. And he defended himself very well. And then I remember the one too where we were all presented about React for the very first time. And people were using React inside of Angular, which was weird. But once that came onto the scene and we started learning about React, things really changed because that's when I started getting into open source really deeply. Started looking into building my own open source packages, and that's also around the same time that I got involved in Chart.js, which I was a maintainer on Chart.js for a couple of years in the early days. So
makes sense. Got the full picture. And did you like you mentioned that did you study computer science in the University of Utah? Because in the LinkedIn you study like digital media at the Utah Valley University. Is that right?
Yeah. So back in 2013 or whatever, it was called digital media, and then you would have a focus on something.
Okay, makes sense.
And they didn't even have a like web development track, and they definitely weren't teaching new web development stuff. They were teaching PHP, they were teaching C# classes. It was kind of a crossover between like digital media and design and like traditional IT and software.
Okay.
So the digital media part of it, like I learned about accessibility and I learned about like the design aspects of it as well. But then we had some pretty hardcore programming principles classes that were uncomfortable for like a lot of design people. But yeah, that's where. So it was at Utah Valley University is where I kind of finished out. I did my first semester. I did my first 2 semesters at BYU actually. Doing film.
Okay.
Yeah. And then in between BYU and Utah Valley University, I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for 2 years in Brazil. So that was a little bit of a hiatus on education, but well worth it. Very awesome.
Yeah, makes sense. Got the point. That's great. And also, like you mentioned that this is the time that you evolve into open source, and one of the you have been maintaining a Charge.js
Yeah.
library. And during that time, you work like you will like working like a part time, as I mentioned, or like as I imagine, and you have been working maybe in like simply Mac or like what was like your full time position back then when you are maintaining the.
That was even before all
Charge.js?
that. Before I got into even building apps, I worked at a third-party Apple retailer called Simply Mac. So I worked at the Genius Bar and just fixed everybody's MacBooks all day, which was fun. That was great. But my first job I got because this guy came into Simply Mac and was like, hey, I need a website. And I was like, oh, I know how to build websites. And he's like, oh, yeah? If you can build this website with all this functionality in the next 2 weeks, I'll give you a job. So I built it in 3 days. I delivered it to him, and he gave me the job. So I worked at this scrapbook. It's a scrapbook publishing company for a little while. And pretty soon, the guy who gave me the job, he moved on to something else, started a new company, and he promoted me to the VP of technology at that company. And I worked there for a year doing everything, but mostly PHP, a little bit of WordPress. That's when WooCommerce was hot. We were using a little bit of WooCommerce. And then I think I worked there for like a year and a half, and then they decided to sell the company, and I was looking for a new job like immediately. And that's when I met my friends who helped, who kind of helped me get into React, and they were the ones that I started Nozzle with. So they found me at a meetup, and they're like, hey, we're starting a new company. Why don't you come and be our front end guy? And I was like, okay, cool. I worked at SEO.com with them for a short little while before we actually started the company. And then 6 months into starting the company, they made me a co-founder. So I actually started as an employee first, and then became a co-founder later.
Okay, makes sense. So currently, I got the full picture right now, and we covered like a good ground for the timeline of like your story. And currently, I would love to dive deep into the TanStack and how the idea came from. What did you see in the market, like the gap in the market? Because I remember it. I think you are the founder of React Query. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And like it started with React Query, and after that it evolved to a full stack framework, to the TanStack right now that we are currently having to discuss the story behind that full stack framework. Can you give us the backstory of where the idea of the TanStack or the React Query came from?
Yeah, it actually didn't start with React Query. Okay. The first library that I made was Table, React Table. And I built React Table because I needed a data grid. And when we moved to React, there wasn't a native data grid for React. There were some that had wrappers, like AG Grid was there. There were a few others, but none of them were like native to React rendering. So I built React Table as a component that would let you render really good tables. And it took off. And I think people really enjoyed it. I liked it. I used it at Nozzle. And then let's see, after React Table, I started actually building, people don't really know this or remember this, but I've already built a framework before. It was called Jumpsuit, and I built that with Jason Maurer. And we didn't work on that very long, but Jumpsuit was actually based around Redux and React, and it wasn't full stack. It was just a client-side framework. But we thought it was pretty cool. It didn't last very long. Jason had other plans. I was quickly getting tired of Redux, but At the time, I wanted to build a static site generator. So we were building our marketing site for Nozzle, and I was like, oh, we should do this in React because I'm going to be the one who's maintaining it. So I started building this framework called React Static, and it was a static site generator. So this was before serverless was big, before Lambdas really took off. So the SSR story for React was still very early and young. It was very difficult to just spin something like that up on your own really easily. Unless you were running a long running server, there just weren't frameworks for it to make it super easy for everyone to consume. So static site generation was the hot thing because of that. And this was around the same time that Gatsby and Next.js, early Next.js, was taking off. And in those early days, I actually was competing very heavily with Next.js and Gatsby on static site generation. And there was a brief little while there where like React Static was the fastest React static site generator out there. I had figured out how to do parallel processing for exports, like multi-threading. So our ability to export was much faster than like Gatsby and Next. But it got to the point where it turns into a framework. And other than having the server side part of it, it really was almost the same amount of work that it is building a framework today. We had to do custom code splitting using like React Loadable. We had to do weird things with CSS and import maps. And it was really crazy. It just became like a full-time job, but I didn't want it because I already had a startup. So I decided to give React Static away to the community. They ran with it for a little while, but I went back to just focusing on writing stuff for Nozzle. And that's when React Query started because I was in the thick of it with Redux and we were managing a lot of data on the client. There were points where we were loading in just hundreds of megabytes, sometimes up to a gig of data, and it was constantly being updated and cached, and it just was really difficult to work with Redux to do that. And so I built React Query initially on top of Redux as a way to manage all of the state and use it just internally inside of Nozzle. That worked really well, and I liked it. And so I was like, hey, I should open source this like I did my table library. So I built and React Static as well. So I built it into an open source library, and instead of using Redux, I just built my own store underneath that was like specially designed for the task. And that was the first version of React Query. So after that, it's kind of history. It was the right place at the right time. That's about the same time when React Hooks came out, and it was the perfect syntax and platform for something like that to exist.
Makes sense. So it's like the timeline. You start with React Static, which is an alternative to Gatsby and Next.js static site generator before the two like alternative come out. So you are like the early adopter of static site generator for React based application, which is really good because I remember like at the time when Gatsby was very popular, so there's a lot of hype or trend for static site generation. I think remember maybe 2020 2021 it was a lot of hype around that, and after that you move out to React Query, which is like an easier way to use Redux without the syntax of using Redux, and it was great for like a network request, so you can do a lot of like a network requests, especially with the use query and the other like other hooks. And it's, as you mentioned, it was the right time because you just like made hooks before like a React hooks was out, like from the team of like a Meta. It was like at the right moment. And so like coming off the story, so you build React stitches out of, you would like to build a static site for React, and you build React Query internally for the Nozzle company because you are like seeing a gap there, and you build this, and after that you like open source it to the community and people love it. And after that React Query got very popular and a lot of people use it, and also like a big company uses. And after that you start building other layers that will become the TanStack, because the TanStack have like other layer. One of them is the React table and the React Query, and there will be other stuff that will make a full stack framework. Can
Yeah.
we give the story from when the React query got popular until the TanStack was a full stack framework?
So after React Query got popular, I looked into a couple of other libraries that I needed. So I wasn't happy with form libraries, so I started working on TanStack Form. It was just called React Form back then. And I actually built it and used it for a while, but I still wasn't happy with my own creation and actually killed off React Form a couple of years ago. I also built, React Ranger and React, a new virtualizer library that was headless. And those were really good. It was around this same time too that, so one of the first critical pieces too was I needed to set up the open source organization so that it could be cross framework and agnostic to framework. Because at that time, everything was React something, React Query, React Table. So I decided to rebrand under TanStack and rebrand all these libraries and start rewriting them, or at least rewriting their cores as agnostic. So just TypeScript, and then creating adapters for specific frameworks around them. So that was the first big step, and that took a while. I did that. The very first one we did was TanStack Query, and then we did Table, and then we kind of did all the others after that. So that was a first big critical piece, was rebranding everything to TanStack, simply because we needed a better name that didn't involve React something or Vue something or whatever. I tried it for a little bit, actually. You might see like Vue Query, Vue Table or whatever, but I just didn't want to maintain, one brand for every library framework combination. That's stupid.
Yeah,
So
makes sense.
we rebranded under TanStack, and along with that rebrand and those rewrites, we also went really deep into TypeScript. So it took me a while to get on the TypeScript train, but once I did, everything needed to be TypeScript and type safe. So we rewrote TanStack Query and Table to be type safe, and that took a while. And then eventually, when all of that was done, it was all under TanStack. It was all type safe and TypeScript and framework agnostic. I started looking into routing because it felt like the very last piece of Nozzle that was really not a great experience. We were using React Router at the time, V5, and they were teasing V6. I think V6 was in beta for like 2 years, and we used V6 for those 2 years, and it was much better. It had a lot of good stuff, but during that time, they were also building Remix, focusing on Remix. So it took a while for some of those features of Remix to end up in the new V7. So there was a long time where I was using Remix for some side project stuff, and I really liked it, but I needed a better routing experience for my SPA, like for Nozzle. And I was also running into some pretty big limitations with React Router V6 beta at Nozzle. Mostly around, like a lot of it was around types, so it wasn't type safe at all, really. V6 was. And then it also was just really, it didn't have the APIs that I thought it should have had for managing state in the URL. It owned the URL essentially for, when you have a router, it basically owns the URL. And I was storing a lot of state in the URL with search parameters, and even like hashes and just different things to make it so that people could sift through the data and the dashboards that we had for them and share those links with their team, and also bookmark them and come back and have everything look exactly the same. So to do that, you need really, really good URL management. And I just wasn't getting that from V6. I tried extending it, and I did. I actually built a bunch of custom router logic on top of React Router 6 beta. And it was pretty crazy what I was doing. I got to the point where I was actually proxying every single export from React Router beta 6. And I was like, okay, I basically have built my own version of React Router. I looked into doing some upstream contributions, They were focused on other things. They weren't really interested in type safety at the time. They weren't interested in some of the search parameter APIs that I had designed. So at that point, it was either fork or build something new, because I needed a little bit more control to kind of fully realize the tools that I had designed. I wasn't going to get it with React Router v6. So I decided then to take all of my extra logic that I had and, replant it on top of a new core router. And so I decided to build something called React Location, which was just a toy router, basically just for Nozzle, but I also open sourced it. And it was kind of my first experience of learning how to build a router from the ground up. And it wasn't great. It was good. It was fine. It wasn't the best router because I learned a lot doing that. And I didn't really look at any other like routing implementation code. There was Wouter, there's React Router, Gatsby was open source, Next.js was open source. I really wanted it to be like my own interpretation of how routing is supposed to work. So I built everything from the ground up. I even built my own history management library, which is a lot on its own, just a good history management library. Other than the public APIs that I had worked with in these other libraries, I didn't really know much about it. So that first version of React Location was that. It was kind of my interpretation of how to build a router. But it got really interesting when, we started using that at Nozzle, and it was pretty good. It gave me the runtime functionality almost that I needed, but the type safety still wasn't there because I didn't know how to do a type safe router. It was still a lot better than what I had, but it just didn't it didn't match my expectations for what I was hoping to build. I was still casting a lot of things. And so that's when I set out and I started researching really heavily on how to do like really complex type safe systems. TanStack table is a pretty complex system, but it doesn't have a lot of like hierarchical context like a router does, that spans an entire application. So I had to do a lot of R&D to learn how to build a TypeScript system that could span an entire app and still be fully inferred. And so that's where you see kind of the interesting structure and syntax of like TanStack router. That's where that was born, was in this research. And it took a while to figure out, but once I figured that out, that's when I started the really long journey of building TanStack router and ultimately TanStack start. So honestly, can't even remember the year because everything's blended together. But I know that let's see, TanStack router's been out for a year and a half. I worked on it for 2 years, almost 2.5 years before I released it. So I've been working on routing for the last 4.5 years, 4.5 years. And it's a really complex problem to solve. But so the router's been out for a year and a half. It's been stable. It's fully type safe. I think it was a really big moment for type safety that we were able to do that. We had some interesting patterns that I'd never seen before. I really do think it was pretty novel. TanStack start. So this is when it gets interesting to me because I didn't want to have to build a framework. I really didn't. I had already done it once and I didn't like the challenges that it presented with React Static. And I knew it was going to be even harder this time around. So I really didn't want to build a framework, but I knew that I might have to. So I already had the router, and having a router is really 80% of the challenge of building a framework, because you can't really build a full stack framework without a router that can do both client side and server side. So you'll end up there anyway. I knew I was really close, but there was going to be a lot more work to go. But at this point, building a full stack JavaScript framework based on the router wasn't something that Nozzle needed. Up to that point, everything else that I had built is something that we needed at Nozzle. But a full stack framework, we didn't need that. There's some things about it that would be helpful. It would be nice to have, but it wasn't necessary because TanStack Router with Vite was enough for what we had built. We had a SaaS application. We didn't need SSR. We just needed to render on the client and let people look at all these charts and dashboards and stuff. So that came to a bit of a turning point there where I thought about building this framework. I decided, let's just dig back into Nozzle. But the people started using TanStack Router to build enterprise applications. The uptake, the people who used the router, it's not that many. It's still not that many today, but the people who are using it are building very significant projects with it because it's very nice to use if you're building big, large enterprise applications with really hairy URL management and things. So, the usage is not in the millions or anything yet, but the people who are using it are very sophisticated and the projects being built with it are pretty intense. And a lot of those people started asking me about a full stack framework. They're like, we would really love this. We would use it if you built it. I didn't even need to try it out to know that I had, a product market fit or an audience for it. People just were telling me, whenever you build a full stack framework, I will use it. So that was interesting to hear. After I started hearing that for a while, I had some people approach me and were just like, hey, how can we help make this happen? A couple of those companies were AG Grid, Vercel, and Convex. Those are some of my earliest sponsors. And they wanted me to invest my time into this project, which was really awesome of them to do. And so I struck a partnership deal with those three initially to kind of help me transition to a full-time role doing TanStack. And not necessarily leave Nozzle, but definitely I've taken a back seat and I'm not in the day-to-day at Nozzle anymore just because of the time requirements to work on TanStack. But it's taken a full-time job at TanStack to really dig in and build TanStack Start. Front-end full-stack frameworks are just no joke, really, really difficult.
Yep, makes sense. And I remember that I had an interview with Wes Boss over this season for the podcast, and we mentioned that TanStack is one of one of the framework that he's currently working with as a full stack framework, and you are competing right now with like a Vercel, with a Remix. There's other like a full stack framework out there, but how do you think, if you are like choosing a tool for the right job, what do you think the TanStack will do the best job for something specific? For example, building a specific type of website or application you need the TanStack for.
So I think the easiest way to answer that is to say that I think TanStack Start and Router are going to be great for most applications, to be honest. By the time we're done with it, there's not something that I wouldn't want to build with it because I do believe that it's built on the best router out there. It has the best features. It's the most type safe. It's really scalable for teams. So there's not very many projects that I would say I don't want to use TanStack to build this. There are a few use cases where I would say it's not the right fit. One of those use cases would be if you are building a Zero.js or a very heavily progressively enhanced application. So if you're targeting devices that are probably not going to run JavaScript at all, or you just don't want to run JavaScript at all, this is not the framework to do that. If that was your goal, you should probably look into something like Astro, something a little more static. Or you could look into even using, something like React Router v7, which I know they have a really big focus on progressive enhancement to be able to, build an application that doesn't use really JavaScript on the client at all, which is really cool. But that's just not our demographic. That's not what TanStack Start or Router is optimized for. Other than that use case, there's still the use case around if you're building a very static site that's not changing very much, then you might be more comfortable with something like Astro or even WordPress, because I just think that if you're not building dynamic application stuff, you're not going to need a lot of the stuff that TanStack's bringing. That is until we have RSC support. So as soon as we add support for React Server Components, we're going to take back a lot of that use case to be able to do static stuff. TanStack.com is a good example of a site that we've built it with TanStack Start to dog food it, and it's been really good using TanStack Start. We're very happy with it, and we've been able to do some really cool dynamic stuff because of it. But most of TanStack.com is static. It's just static documentation that is changing every now and then. And that's a perfect use case, a natural use case for something like Astro or for React Server Components, which, we're not using Astro and we don't have server components yet. But as soon as we do, it really will just leave maybe a sliver of kind of that progressive enhancement area where I would say maybe not the best fit, but for pretty much everything else, I envision it becoming a really versatile tool to build pretty much whatever you want.
Exactly, that's the point. That's great. And also I have a question. So it's been a long time ago since I saw a meme where people or company are making money using open source software, and the people that are maintaining or contributing to the open source software are not getting paid enough. Do you still agree with that as someone who is been contributor to open source software for a long time? Do you agree with this statement, or do you think it's not the same for everyone?
I think largely I would agree that there's a lot of open source out there. There's a lot of open source libraries. To be honest, most of the industry only relies on a very, very small percentage of all of the open source out there. There's relatively very few packages that kind of prop up our industry or even the backend languages and things like that, because there's just a lot of open source that's just out there for fun. So I think there are a lot of people who probably build hobby open source projects who wish they could do it full time and say, man, I wish I got paid more. I think there is a problem for packages that do prop up our industry. Those maintainers are often putting in a lot of time, more time than we realize, to triage issues and provide support and keep updating the libraries. And those people are not being compensated enough. And it really wouldn't take much from our industry to make sure that these core people are propped up. Because the reality is that most open source packages are not maintained by large numbers of people. Usually it's just one to a few people who are doing 99% of the work. And so, if you think about it, if you pick one of your favorite libraries and you say, okay, who's the person maintaining this library that's getting downloaded, 1 billion times a month or something like that, that person could easily be justified of making a 6-figure salary from, any company in Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 that uses that software. Otherwise, if that software dies, it would crumble.
Yes.
But that's the problem, is that there's no way to force that. There's no way to enforce that on either side. So the companies using it don't feel pressure to pay because it's just going to keep being free. And one of the biggest challenges with open source, I think, is that it's looked at as a commodity, so that if one library maintainer decides, I'm done, I'm not going to do this anymore, there's a time period where that library will still keep working, but they'll have time to switch to something else. And if a library maintainer stops maintaining something, it's going to immediately create room in the ecosystem for another person to come in and build something to replace it. So it very much is looked at as a commodity from a lot of companies that use it to say, if it's not this library, it'll be another library. And yeah, if we need to, we can switch, but that's a risk and a gamble they're willing to take. That's what makes it really difficult. And as an open source maintainer, there's very few ways that you can consistently raise money and keep money coming in, even just to sustain yourself. I mean, for the 8 years that I was doing open source on the side, I never made remotely enough money at all to consider doing it even part-time. I mean, it was almost nothing. Even with company sponsorships and GitHub sponsors, it just never was going to bring in enough to consider it full-time. It's not until you have an open source library that is popular enough and well-known enough and has a good brand behind it that you're able to start getting into brand and partnership deals and marketing deals, or even if you didn't do any of those and you just ran ads on your website, you still would need to have a really, really popular library to make that worth it for you to do it full-time. So I just think that the open source sustainability model has a lot of flaws. The fact that TanStack is working and that I'm succeeding at doing that and sustaining it did not happen overnight at all. I've been designing the sustainability model for TanStack for a decade, trying to figure out how I could make it work. And I've seen companies raise venture capital and then a few years later they die. I've seen open source projects raise venture capital and then get acquired, which is awesome for them. But then I've also seen those acquisitions change their priorities and change their motivations. I've seen open source projects who decide to start building paid products or paid versions of their open source. That also changes your motivations, and it changes, do I work more on the paid version or the open source version now? And at the end of the day, it's really difficult to find a balance between how can I keep doing what open source should be, which is building free to use software that is supported by the community and has good support behind it, that's always going to be free, but still somehow make money. It's been a real challenge to figure that out. But so far, TanStack's we've been able to do that. And I'm trying to stay true to the way that I feel about open source, where I don't believe that you should take $1,000 of open source sponsorship money and split it between 1,000 people. Because, like I said, usually 1 or 2 or 3 people are doing 99% of the work. So at TanStack, I try and do things very differently, where I have a set of core maintainers and contributors that I really, really trust. We have a big group of contributors and maintainers now at TanStack who basically in their own right are the backbones of a lot of these libraries. Like Dominic Dorfmeister, TK Dodo, he is React Query now, and Kevin Van Cott, he manages TanStack Table and he's building the next version of it. So these like champions, that come out of the woodwork to say, hey, you know what, I want to be a part of this. I'm trying to treat those individuals as partners and employees and part of the company, and making sure that I'm compensating them as well as much as I possibly can for the work that they're doing, So a bulk, in fact, if you were to go look at all of my GitHub sponsorships, I have a pretty significant amount of GitHub sponsorship money now coming in, but I don't keep really any of that GitHub sponsorship money. All of that money gets redistributed right back to each of my core contributors. So I've been sponsoring each of them for quite a bit for a while now, and I can't wait to sponsor them for even more. I mean, if I had my way, I'd grab a couple more marketing partnership deals and employ all of them full time. I would love to have a team of 5 to 6 people of full time engineers that we could just focus on TanStack. Hopefully we'll get there someday, but right now we're still trying to figure out the sustainability model. And for right now, it's enough for me to be full time on it, which is, I think, really impressive considering that, we haven't raised any venture capital. We don't have any paid products. And as far as I think people really love TanStack products. So as far as I know, we can just keep doing this forever. You know,
Yeah.
we don't need to scale to 50 employees or become some unicorn company or raise money and get into AI. We can just be, you know, a really tight knit group of open source engineers, build great software, and as more and more support and money comes in, we can sustain ourselves even more.
That's great. So that conversation is really important because there's a lot of things that people should know about open source. And also talking about this, like even like a big company that have like the resources to be able to have their own open source projects. If you like go to their like GitHub repo, you will see a lot of like a still open issue for like a quite some time. So it's a lot of work for someone who is not paid to be able to maintain a library. So don't take it for granted. And if you are using the the library, I think the best way is at least to sponsor the project, so the people that are behind that project can like at least get something out. It will not like be like a rewarding number, it will just like a small like appreciation token for what they are doing, because it's a lot of work behind the project, and you can tell from like a big company not even maintaining their own project, nonetheless someone not paid to be able to work on this product, to be able to work on it and maintain it. It's a lot of work behind the scene. And also people, when you are like a building open source project, it's like you are building a startup, you are betting on the success of the project. It's like if the project is popular, you will get like a partnership, you will get sponsor to be able to sponsor your work. Model of like getting paid, for example, you can offer premium support or a paid support for technical support, or also you can offer some commercial license, like for example, I think like a Remotion have like source available, so the source is available but it's not open source, so they can you can use it for free if you are like just one developer or like up to 3 developer. If you are big, you will should like pay for a license to be able to use it, but the code is there, you can like contribute and use it for your own, but you should like pay to be able to use it for commercial. So there's a lot of other ways to be able to get paid with your open source, but it's always you are betting on the projects. If the product succeeds, you will get paid. If not, it will be just a hobby product, and it will not be successful enough to be able to grab the attention of like a sponsorship and company to be able to willing to sponsor the product, so you can work on it full time, because it's a lot of work to be able to maintain a product, and like a much like a support for the people who are maintaining the product, because it's a lot of work and it's unpaid, unfortunately. And also one of the things that, for example, I think it was the first time that I heard that an open source has been acquired, which is the Remix acquisition from Shopify in October 2023, I think. From my I think I remember it was acquisition of Next.js, which is acquired by Shopify. So people can get like a work at Shopify and maintain the Remix product. And this will lead me to a question about open source. Do you think this is the only like a solution or like a available business model for open source to be alive? For example, we mentioned premium support, commercial license, sponsorship. Do you think this is enough for people to work on the project full time? And what do you think, or what lesson that you learned over a decade working and contributing to open source, do you think is worth to people who are just starting out to build another framework to or build like an open source project? Do you think is worth the time that you spend building that open source project, or do you think you should think twice before building an open source project?
So let's talk about motivations first. I would say if you're setting out to build an open source project because you want it to become popular, or you want your library to become popular, or you don't like another open source library and you just want to be better than that one. All of these reasons I think are they're okay reasons, I guess. They'll get you some of the way, but I don't think that those reasons alone are enough to get you to success. Mostly because if you're not building something that you need, then you're already going to fail. You need to be building something that you deeply understand, and you need to be building something that you have that you know the pain points and you've lived them or are living them, and you should be building the tools that you want and need at the moment for yourself. You know, we could go back to kind of the hammer manufacturer analogy, right? Are you going to want to buy a brand new fancy hammer from a guy who has, who hasn't swung a hammer for the last 10 years? Or are you going to want to buy a new hammer that some guy designed who is currently building things all the time with it and who understands the ins and outs and the challenges, right? So I think that's kind of the first indicator of motivations and success that you need to be aware of. Is you need to look at the motivations behind a library, look at why it's being built, why you're building it. And if it's not to help you build better things or genuinely to help other people build better things easier, then the motivations are kind of out of whack. I would question that. And that fuel, if it's not one of those things, then the fuel that you have will only get you so far. Once your library does get popular, you're going to say, okay, problem solved. My library is popular. Or once you push out the incumbent, it's like, okay, I won. And then you just stop, right? There's no more motivation to keep going and keep making it better. So make sure you're using your tools and building tools out of necessity and not out of, grandeur or spite or whatever. To answer your other question, I don't think that, I think this was your first question. I don't think that acquisition, the only way out of an open source sustainability issue. In fact, I think it should probably be looked at as the rare occurrence. Next.js was built internally at Vercel. It wasn't acquired. Next.js was built as an open source utility for people to use that happened to be owned by a hosting company. And they made it really easy for you to build and host kind of in one fell swoop, which is really awesome. That's why it has succeeded so well, is because it's so easy to go from zero to shipped immediately. They didn't acquire Next.js though. So that's something to be aware of. And Remix getting acquired by Shopify, awesome for them. I know that before they got acquired, it was going down a route that looked difficult. They weren't sure how they were going to monetize. They had previously looked into paid licenses, but the future was uncertain. And the fact that they did get acquired by Shopify, I think, is a genius stroke of luck that Shopify needed or wanted exactly what they were providing in that moment, and they were able to strike a good deal. That also, I think Shopify has mostly been a good steward of Remix, which that's not a guarantee. I would say that most of the time, I would wager that if a company big enough to acquire a large open source product is interested in buying it, usually there's going to be motivations behind that acquisition. And Shopify's motivations were technical. I think a lot of it was technical, where they wanted to bolster, the Shopify engineering story around building their applications. But I don't think that would be the case for a lot of acquisitions that could happen. I think most of the time you would see, oh yeah, we're going to buy this open source library that's really popular, and then we're going to try and exploit those users to buy our product somehow, right? And Vercel doesn't do this with Next.js, but it does have a little bit of crossover where Next.js is a big reason of why Vercel is successful, because it is a massive lead generation tool for Vercel, right? If Vercel didn't have Next.js, I don't know if they would have grown as quickly or if they would have gotten the exposure that they got, right? Or would have been able to hire the talent that they have been able to attract because of Next.js. So it's a
like
two-way
lead
street.
magnet.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. It goes both ways. But it's easy to look at something like Remix or look at Next.js and say, oh, that's the way that it should be done. In reality, I think that the idea of having an open source company that doesn't need venture capital and doesn't need to be acquired and can generate its own revenue through brand deals and brand partnerships, that hasn't really been explored a whole lot. And that's what I'm doing right now. The way I look at it is there are Instagram and TikTok accounts out there that are making tens of millions or many, many millions of dollars a year just by being very popular and by being really smart about their partnerships and their brand marketing efforts and their advertising. If TikTok and Instagram accounts can do that, there's really no reason why an open source library couldn't do it either. And in my opinion, I think it's because many developers and software engineers are just not great marketers and they're not great salesmen. I would say that if you're going to get into open source and you know that's what you want to do as a full-time job for a really long time, you need to become a better marketer and you need to become a better salesman. You need to learn about SEO. You need to learn about your users and how to understand them. And you need to learn how to use these tools in a good way, like in an ethical way, right? You're not supposed to exploit your users. You're supposed to be useful to them in some way. And I'd say like right now, we have amazing companies that are partnering with TanStack who are not just there to just sell whatever to our users, right? These are companies that have built amazing products that are actually helpful, who also they have the best interests of our developers in their minds as well. And we're not ramming those companies down our users' throats. We are just trying to make sure that people are aware of great tools out there that we trust and that we use ourselves. And so that's an avenue that I'm exploring right now. It's very new to our industry, I think, to open source. The idea that I have refused to ever build a paid product or ever take venture capital money or otherwise sell out, I think is pretty foreign to some people. So far, so good. We'll see. I can't say that if somebody offered me $50 million right now that I wouldn't hand over TanStack. It's hard to say because it's never happened, but I can say that it would take a lot to pull TanStack away from me right now, personally, mostly just because there's still so much to do, There's still so many things that we could build and make that I would not just want to stop right now. So until I'm satisfied that there's nothing left to build, TanStack's going to stay where it is and funded how it is. So
That's great. It's like a TanStack right now is your baby, so it will be hard for people to pull off your baby from you.
yeah, absolutely.
That's great. So I have two questions right now because it will be the last part of the podcast episode. So the first question will be, you mentioned that you are working on some feature that's like for the TanStack. If you mind sharing some of them. And the second question will be, what are the lessons that you learned over a decade of contributing to open source?
All right. So the short version of kind of the roadmap for TanStack is we're trying to get TanStack Start released. It's very close to a release candidate. I think it will be out this summer, hopefully, summer of 2025.
That's great.
Once TanStack Start is out, personally, I want to go back to TanStack Router and add some more features that I've been wanting, mostly parallel routes and a couple of others, things that I think TanStack Router really needs. Parallel to that, we have other projects that are happening that I'm now no longer the only person building libraries at TanStack. Kyle Matthews from Gatsby, who is now a co-founder at Electric SQL, has been working on a new library called TanStack DB that I'm really excited about.
Interesting.
And TanStack DB builds on top of TanStack Query, and it gives you like the local first sync experience for the client. Now, it doesn't fulfill all of the needs that you would need for a sync engine on the server side. But if you could think of it, it's like the TanStack Query for sync engines. It's the client side part of it that is agnostic and can work with anything. You just need the right adapters to hook up to it, and you can have a local first sync engine inside of your application. Very, very cool stuff. I would definitely keep your eye on that. In other news, so Kevin Van Cott has recently released TanStack Pacer, which is like debouncing, throttling, queuing utilities. And TanStack Pacer is a pretty interesting library. It's kind of our first utility library, but I would keep an eye on that one. We're also working on TanStack Select, which is a headless select picker experience. So if you could imagine something like ARIA Complete or even Downshift, but just way more feature packed and headless, kind of and works across every single framework. So we're working on TanStack Select, and then a little much further out probably is TanStack Time, which is going to be our take on time manipulation UI library. So we are building TanStack Time to help you build UI experiences that deal with time. So
Okay. Like a
date pickers, date range pickers, calendars, scheduling systems, anything that, and it's going to all be headless. So you could use TanStack Time as a primitive to build out like your own calendar widget or